Science Uncut, presented by the Volkswagen Foundation.
I'm very glad to welcome Paul, and I'm very curious about your perspective on all those questions.
Thanks, Martin, and I can now dispense with 3 of my slides after that short exposition. I don't know which of the 3, unfortunately, but I'll see if I can work them out. And thanks to Martin, Nicole, and the other organizers for the invitation. It's a great conference. It's great to bring together Labour scholars from different countries and different disciplines. So I hope I can make some useful contribution to this. The title is slightly different. It did have the word global in it, and then I thought, stick to what you know. I don't know enough about the global south to pontificate about developments there, so I've narrowed the range a little. So when I look through the conference program and as it has evolved, I tried to pick up some themes which I could plug into. They're not all the same, but a recurrent theme to me appeared to be the diversity of labour conditions and labour agency. How the conditions under which labour is working are being changed by changes in political economy and other factors, and the extent to which that's shaping, limiting, constraining, facilitating different types of labour agency. And particularly how that's reproducing conflicts and contradictions, but also connections and disconnections. One of the primary themes of this talk will be that disconnection is as frequent as connection in the relationships between the conditions of labour and labour agency. Now, labour process is one of the key themes of the conference. I'm well aware that labour process as a territory is not necessarily the same as labour process as a perspective. And to me, labour process as a perspective is basically a focus on the transformation of labour power. Who, where, what, how, but not only within the workplace, but fundamentally is shaped within capitalist political economy. As Jonathan Patton, who also is speaking at this conference and uses labour process perspectives to an extent, says that in labour process perspectives, connections are made between workplaces, the state, and broader social structures and economic landscapes. And what I'm particularly interested in is the dialectic of labour, capital, and managerial agency. And like him, I want to focus predominantly on the notion of control regime as a key focal point for understanding labour conditions and labour agency. We were asked, and this came up in the introduction to the conference yesterday, to take the mid-1970s, or the economic crises of the mid-1970s, that this should function as a common point of reference. So I decided to take this literally and think, what was I doing in the mid-1970s? Right? And so I've entitled this, The Mass Worker and Me. Right? That is this leaflet, which I co-wrote and gave out outside the Ford Halewood plant in Merseyside. I spent most of the 1970s giving leaflets outside car plants, mostly in my home city in Liverpool, but in Fiat Mia Fury and all over the place. 40 years later, this leaflet, like me, is rather faded. So you can see that it you can't really see the content, but it's called More Time for Us, Less for Them. And I was part of a small leftist group that was of a similar political persuasion to groups like Lotta Continua in Italy, except we were a lot smaller. Our focus was the mass worker, both theoretically and empirically. And the reason I start with the mass worker is that the notion of the mass worker brought into focus a substantive politics of production. And a politics of production is something which labor process accounts have always tried to focus on. The traditional left had, in a way, denied a politics of production, that work under capitalism was basically benign, neutral, or getting better, and the key contradictions were to do with distribution and ownership. And the struggles of workers in the big Fordist factories were, in a sense, the primary means through which that was challenged. However, and so this leaflet, in a sense, embodied some of the kind of typical politics around that at the time, which picked up on some of these Italian autonomist themes of the so-called refusal of work, which was embodied in this context around the idea of winning back time. The most successful campaign, this leftist group that was a mixture of young workers from the plant and people like me, ever ran at Ford Halewood, was a campaign that we called Friday Night is Music Night. And it was a campaign to abolish the 4-hour night shift on the Friday night, and actually succeeded. Sometime in the 1970s, we stopped giving leaflets outside car plants in Liverpool. I won't go into the detail, and so did everybody else, pretty much. And in a sense, it revealed something about the limits of that politics of production, because its Italian progenitors had by then moved on from the mass worker to other supposed class agents, the socialized worker, and so on. And what it reveals is this point that the notion of the mass worker was, in a sense, I've called it here, overstretched by links that were impossible to sustain and unrealistic expectations. I mean, the notions of the refusal of work were only realistic in the context of a pre-revolutionary situation, which, despite the endless fantasies of leftists in the 70s, were never on the cards. But the mass worker was also, as one Italian commentator noted at the time, supposed to be the privileged subject of exploitation. And that privileged subject of exploitation is linked to what we began to discuss yesterday in terms of an emancipatory agent, the universal class, the notion that there is an indissoluble link between the conditions of labor and labor agency. And it's certainly my contention that that link has always been a burden, not a bonus, for understanding labor agency. And it's a point that I'm going to return to at various stages. Now, since then, the heyday of the mass worker and that 1970s and 80s politics of production, as Nicole said yesterday, things got pretty gloomy. I seem to have spent the last 30 years defending the idea that work matters, that the labor process is relevant, that value is still created inside production, that workers still retain some capacity to resist. Now, Nicole was optimistic about how that's changing. I am maybe slightly less optimistic on that. And I'll try and explain a little bit why in these couple of slides. I quote Beverly Silvers also at this conference. Since the 1990s, it's been commonplace for scholars and political commentators around the world to speak of the death of labor and class-based political movements. And certainly labor process scholars, and this has a very specific dynamic to the kind of debates we've been compelled to take part in around the labor process conference, have been facing a challenge that many mainstream and radical perspectives no longer see the workplace as a contested terrain, as was mentioned. And this is to some extent linked to the whole postmodern, post-structuralist turn in which the indeterminacy of labor is relegated to second place behind the indeterminacy of meaning. This, to get one point in straight in this conference in which quite rightly the global south is hugely significant, these are debates overwhelmingly about the global north, in which the people who claim the death of labor and labor struggles are either not interested in or completely ignorant of the global south. But I think it's important to understand that the claims made about the death of labor agency were not simply about the decline of union density or strikes. They were claims about the destruction of informal self-organization, the basic infrastructure of labor agency in the workplace, by either technological or culturally driven forms of self-discipline and surveillance. And you can find variations of this debate in France, in Italy, in Germany, as well as in the UK. Another trend, a more recent one, has been to dissolve labor agency into a general theory of resistance. We now have something called resistance studies, which is treated as a generic category without a specific empirical object or context. I find this problematic, not because I think that other forms of resistance, social movements, wider class-based issues around climate change are not significant. As I say on this slide, this is an issue of distinctiveness, not decisiveness. Right? It's just that if you try and analyze labor conditions and labor agency without a specific focus on the employment relationship and the capitalist political economy that shapes it, and the notion of labor as a commodity, you fail to see the conditions and the distinctive dynamics which drive it if you simply put it alongside, like I said, in a recent paper which justified the notion of resistance studies, the French resistance during the Second World War, Occupy, and struggles against climate change. The other reason I'm less optimistic than Nicole is certainly in the UK, and I suspect in Germany and other places, there's been a real push for the left to get behind the idea of a post-work politics. This has received a big boost with the popularity of works like Paul Mason's Post-Capitalism book. I believe he pulls in 2,000 or 3,000 people to listen to him in German cities, so I know that he's popular, and in other places. I haven't the time to go into the detailed theory, evidence, or in his case, the complete lack of it, in relation, or the theoretical influences. Let me just stick to some of the basics. He and other people argue for a post-work politics whose central demand is a universal basic income. I'm not keen on this, but I'm not going to critique it. The key thing about it, in relation to its interface with production and work, is it uses Marx's fragments on machines from the Grundrisse to argue that the real subordination of labor has been supplanted by the hegemony of the general intellect, characterized by cooperative and autonomous labor. Living labor is no longer subordinated or incorporated into science and machinery. And the point about this is, it's this argument that, in a sense, capitalism is abolishing itself, right, as it's moving towards this period that Marx anticipated in the fragment on machines, and in which the focus of struggle moves outside the workplace and production, to the sphere of consumption, distribution, general patterns of resistance, and so on. And there's an interesting quote that I give from Mason here in one of his endless articles in The Guardian, where he says, "The most important question facing us is not whether Uber drivers should have employment rights, they should, but what to do in a world where automation begins to eradicate work." Well, actually, if you're an Uber driver, that is the most important question. Not because automation has not just eradicated work, but because Uber drivers haven't got time to wait until capitalism actually abolishes itself. Right? And in a way, but it could be a long wait, let's face it. I mean, the left's been using the concept of late capitalism for about 40 years, you know? But capitalism's not a boss, you know? It can't be late. And so that this raises this whole issue about automation, and hence my little picture of robots there. And alongside these claims that automation is eradicating jobs rapidly, which basically just isn't true, is a parallel claim that's kind of linked to the old politics about the refusal of work, that actually people hate work. And I quote this Rutger Bregman guy, who's also been pushing universal basic income. "For the vast majority of people, work offers no meaning, fulfillment, or redemption. It is sorry, this is Snurchek and Williams. Simply something to pay the bills." And Bregman quoted, he likes to use this term bullshit job, which he takes from David Graeber. And he refers to a recent poll that found as many as 37% of British workers think they have a bullshit job. A final point before I start kicking this stuff is that Mason, Snurchek and Williams and others are profoundly pessimistic about labor agency. They regard the labor movement and labor in an informal sense to be defeated, demoralized, and sclerotic. Now, this probably hasn't come out too well either, but this is the actual, I'm going to start with this point. This is the actual survey by the YouGov company that Bregman made his claim about bullshit jobs. You do notice that the word bullshit does not, strictly speaking, appear in the question. In fact, the question is your job making a meaningful contribution to the world? Now, I don't know about you, but that's a question I've often asked myself. And normally answered it in the negative. So what is actually remarkable is not the 37%, but the 50% who claim it does. Now, in my day job, when I'm not kicking post-structuralists or autonomous Marxists or other things with post in front of it, I'm a sociologist of work, and this is my territory, and I've been cheeky enough to quote myself in a recent paper that I did with a colleague, Tricia Finley, which tried to summarize what we know about people's attachment to their work. Surveying qualitative research evidence indicates a complex mixture of positive attachments to work and work identity, but also increasing concerns about issues such as insecurity, recognition, underemployment, work pressures, and unfair rewards. In other words, there is a growing divergence between what work demands from us and what we demand from work. This is a long-winded way of saying that the raw material for a political production is alive and well in the workplace. We have to get used to the fact that people can have positive attachments to work without hating it. They can hate the things that are done to them at work and want to improve them to make it better, transform work. The other point, which is moving on to a different site in a way, is this idea that value extraction is now through rent-seeking or outside production in the totality of social life. Let's leave aside whether value extraction is taking place in these spheres. And just note that the idea that value extraction is not taking place inside production is completely at odds with everything we know, and there will be papers on this in this conference about what is going on inside large companies, what is going on in relation to the financialization of the economy and attacks on labor, and what's going on in terms of value capture inside value chains. Financialization in particular, as my own work on disconnected capitalism shows, is a primary driver of work intensification and insecurity, of labor market externalization and market discipline. Let me move to the final bit of this somewhat heterogeneous slide and just make a point about claims to do with automation and the fourth industrial revolution. There are very few benefits in getting old. almost the only one is that you remember the previous debates. We've been here before with these claims in almost identical terms. You could go back to the end of the 1970s and the early 1980s with arguments about the microchip and software technologies, and the same kind of people wrote the same kind of books with the same kind of claims. They were wrong then and they're wrong now. A guy that Paul Mason quotes voluminously, Jeremy Rifkin, you'll have heard of him, some of you, wrote a book in 1985 called The End of Work. It's not even worth critiquing that. In Britain and the US, we are now at record levels of employment. The key issue is what kind of employment. That's the politics of production. So this brings me to why we should bury the gravedigger thesis. I don't know how widespread this term gravedigger thesis is, but it's basically what we were debating yesterday, which is the link between labour's place as a commodity in production and the so-called emancipatory project. One could reformulate it as the labour interest in work and in society. I define it there as that the proletariat would be compelled to challenge and transform class society by virtue of its objective location in the system of production, becoming both leading and universal liberating class. So a lot of leftists and a lot of people active in labour studies in the broader sense are constantly compelled to look for these connections between the two, to look for the gravedigger. This may seem a bit of a diversion, but I have to mention Jeremy Corbyn at this point. Because, in a way, Jeremy Corbyn was postulated yesterday as, you know, the kind of optimism in relation to the labour interest in society. As those thousands of kids were singing, "Ooh, Jeremy Corbyn," middle-class kids at Glastonbury, the Conservative Party got its highest ever share of the working class vote in that general election. In fact, the Conservatives outpolled Labour 44 to 42% in the categories C1, C2, D, and E, which is generally speaking taken to be the working class. Now, I'm a Labour Party member, and trust me, I was just as joyous when that exit poll came through as anybody else. But there is a massive a kind of upturning of class politics going on in the global north, and it is foolish to believe otherwise. There is very little connection now between labour agency and the labour interest in the workplace, the politics of production, actual and potential, and its representation in the broader political sphere. I mentioned two versions of this. One is the autonomist variant after the mass worker, in which autonomists seek a dominant figure of labour. They've gone from the mass worker to the socialised worker to immaterial labour and finally to the multitude. I describe this as politics in search of economics. In other words, it's a kind of wish fulfillment notion about politics, which is searching for some kind of economics in which it would make sense. Boffo describes it as a politicized version of value in search of the transcendental political subject against capital. The point about this is that because this current tries to cling to some kind of Marxist lineage, they have to frame it in terms of being involved in value relations. And this is picked up in the second version, Christian Fuchs, and digital labor, which I describe as economics in search of politics, in which he's done some very interesting work on digital labor, certainly on the digital firms, but he is determined to construct a class agency through changes in value relations, which can act as the new gravedigger. So this is a sheet from his Labor and Informational Capitalism, and it's basically trying to argue, he says that these are the subclass fractions of the multitude: traditional industrial workers, knowledge workers, house workers, the unemployed, migrants and workers in developing countries, retirees, students, precarious and informal workers. And you do wonder, how is capitalism standing? Because this is a purely theoretical construct. This is the multitude constructed as a political subject around some notion of the production of value. And basically, it has no value as a guide to explanation or action, particularly when Fuchs also adds in, because he's a fan of a concept called the audience commodity, in which and we all create value for capital now every time we update our Facebook status. I'm sure some of you are probably doing this now. Or like, or retweet something on Twitter, so that even more people are then drawn into this process. Now, I'm not sure whether the gravedigger thesis was ever true. Probably the most I'm willing to go to is that, say, in the 1920s, it was less untrue. You know, in a period when the leaders of a number of the major emerging communist parties in the 1920s were all skilled lathe turners, one can see something of the kind of gravedigger thesis. But the working class, labor in production, was never the universal emancipatory class. That idea was always nonsense. And it's become even less plausible as labor has become diversified, fragmented, and so on. But that's a far step from labor as an agency being dead or defeated. We need tools for understanding labor, its capacity for self-organization, resistance in the workplace, a distinctive politics of production. So I'm going to move on in the next bit to talk about what a more realistic perspective on resistance might be that draws on what labor process I mean, there's been times, particularly in English language debates in Europe, in which labor process approaches have been the last redoubt holding out for any notion of resistance in the workplace, particularly in that period in the 1990s when everybody did the turn to Foucault and panopticons and self-discipline and whatever. But labor process theory has regarded the workplace as a contested terrain, but with labor and capital more as local rather than universal actors. The core conceptual innovation, to some extent, was the control regime. And this appeared in two kind of frames. One was in the kind of early major works of labor process research like Friedman and Borowoy and Edwards, in which one got linear or contrasting ideotype models corresponding to different stages of capitalist development. And I just want to mention Borowoy because he seems to be the one that has had the lasting impact. And, you know, The Politics of Production is a wonderful book. But I still think its central claim is flawed. Borowoy tries to develop a politics of production which moves, as he says himself, not only from the factory, but from 3 small workshops to what regulation theorists would call accumulation regimes. So the core concepts became factory despotism, and after that, hegemonic despotism. I've seen so many papers in which the punchline is hegemonic despotism. To know that it's had an influence, I don't buy it. I don't find the term hegemonic despotism to have any significant explanatory power. For the same reasons I find other things, it's overstretched. It covers too much ground. It covers too much geographic, political, historic ground. As control regimes, yeah, it's just an overstretched and overburdened concept. I prefer the type of conceptions which labor process researchers try to develop, in which managerial regimes were more localized configurations of control mechanisms and worker action. They became too localized and too workplace-centric, but they were attempted to ground labor agency in more realistic contexts. And what some of us also tried to do was to try to develop a language around resistance which expanded the categories of what Belanger and Thudereau called repertoires of opposition at work. So I want to mention just some new applications of control regimes. Again, to refer to Jonathan Patterson, he's one of his papers refers to 3 levels of control regime: a macro labor control regime based on the broader dynamics of capital accumulation, local labor control regimes which link the macro regime to actual forms of exploitation and control within the labor process. Now, I have a version of this argument, but which has a much more bounded concept of control regime. In other words, I don't think we should use the term control regime to describe what I call accumulation regime there. Again, it's back to my favorite theme, overstretched and overburdened. accumulation regimes, which are basically about the configurations and dynamics between different circuits of capital, are not essentially concerned with control. Control reappears in the regulatory regime and more specifically in the control regime. Regulatory regimes are to do with state strategies, they're to do with labor market and other regulatory norms. Control regimes focus on labor utilization, on the characteristics of conversion of labor power, on actual concrete control mechanisms and contractual relations. But they also embed certain notions of labor's power within that control regime. So I'm going to skip some of these. I've got some applications here of 3 different types of control regime, but as time is pressing, I'm going to just use one of them. So I had digital labor platforms, but as that's the most complicated, I'm going to skip over it to logistics, distribution, and warehousing, and particularly research that's been done on Amazon fulfillment centers. The basic point I'm trying to make here is that control regimes are focused on empirical objects in particular sectors, particular business models, particular value chains or segments of value chains. And so that this is research which shows how logistics, distribution, and warehousing have become central to the circuits of capital, and also some of the current limits to automation. One of the points of emphasizing this is that in Amazon fulfillment centers, it gives the lie to the autonomous claim that labor time is no longer subject to managerial attention. Lean methodologies speed up targets, electronic tacking, numerical flexibility through permanent temps. These produce techno-bureaucratic control hybrids, which are supplemented by direct supervision and the use of labor market insecurity as a form of market discipline. Labor agency, there are attempts to unionize. This is a tough arena to organize labor in. And there are unionization efforts, certainly in the UK. There's lots of low-level recalcitrance and misbehaviors. There's campaigns that link it to wider social movements. But I'm going to have to move on. There was my other illustration, VFX and the film industry. So 2 slides left, be very quick. I just wanted to draw some themes together there about understanding labor agency in its full range of categories. One of the things that we tried to do in labor process research is actually to get away from the idea that you either talk about resistance or you talk about nothing. Labor agency is not just about resistance. I mean, particularly in, it's important not to focus too much on, like, where's the next strike wave coming from? Labor agency was never predominantly focused around the strike, let alone the strike wave. And so we distinguish between worker resistance, which is intentional, upwardly directed action against employers or their agents, of which class-based resistance is a further form of that. But we also talk about, building on my work with Stephen Ackroyd on worker misbehavior, forms of recalcitrance, which we define as anything you do at work or think at work that you are not supposed to. And these include service sabotage, dissent, cyber loafing, in so words, surfing the net when you should be doing something productive for capital, and other forms of work limitation. But labor agency is also about resilience, the basic infrastructure of everyday acts of informal self-organized support, community to coping, emotional labor as a gift, cynicism, disengagement from managerial resources. We have to understand this in its fullest sense. Otherwise, we are vulnerable to these ideas that class-based action or labor agency in the broader sense is declining. And I did intend to talk about how online forums were good examples of this, but again, time is short. So I've just got two concluding comments here. Again, to quote Beverly Silver, where capital goes, labor conflict follows. That is true. But we have to allow, like I said on the last slide, for its varied content and form that reflects this variety of oppositional practices. We've got to dump this idea that there is some automatic link between labor agency and some kind of broader emancipatory practice, a project. Not that we have to give up the idea of that emancipatory project. It's our job as labor scholars, I think, to look for the connections, both empirical and conceptual, and try to engender practically those connections as much as we can, but without losing sight of the distinctiveness or legitimacy of different types and levels of struggle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Just a question to the organizers, because we are running out of time. We started later, so how flexible are we regarding lunch? Yeah, so let's allow for 20 minutes at least of questions and debate. We have anyway, 7:15. Perfect. Yeah. So we have a lot of time. So please free to formulate all kind of resistance, dissent, or other forms of comments. The floor is open to you. There is a question up there. The very last row.
Test. Okay, hello. My name is Colin, and maybe this was the only presentation where I could introduce myself, because I'm not an academic, but I'm with a small newspaper which comes from the autonomist tradition, and we still do sometimes leafleting in factories, in white factories like hospitals, in the places where there is a new mass of workers like Amazon warehouses. And we still sometimes do workers' inquiry. And because of that, I'm still believing in the gravedigger thesis, but I think it's not, the working class is a demonic gravedigger, and the demons are not always morally positive, and because of that, it needs a wider movement to get a positive emancipatory outcome. And I wanted to say 2 points. The first is that when we speak with workers, this connection between the positive worker identity, the positive view that one is a good worker, has become stronger with the loss of work security. And today, even these guys who are smoking weed in the corner of the factory, they are thinking they are good workers. And in the 60s or 70s, that wasn't the case that much. Or even the women and guys who are working for €9 at a Daimler factory are telling their family, I'm a Daimler worker, and it's really absurd because they are only getting €9 and not 16 or 25 like the normal workers are getting. And I think that's one of the big problems at the moment, that the loss of security became a stronger worker identity. And the second point is that we see a lot of dissent in factories, and not only in Germany, but also, for example, in Turkey, where comrades tell that in the AKP areas, the workers who are mainly voting for AKP are the ones who are at the moment carrying on those illegal strikes where the police shuts those strikes down, and it's really a rift between the political representation and what they are voting at the voting booth and the stuff they do at the work floor. And I think it's because we are at a historical, open and really uncertain situation at the moment where it isn't clear in which direction it will go on in the future.
Okay, let's take questions or comments from 3 persons, and then you can decide to whom you want to answer. So Nicole raised her hand. So here in the very first row, or maybe just Chase, because I think, yeah, please, come on. And then on your right side, there's someone with the blue.
Yes,
yeah, please.
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think because then she doesn't make the way make the way twice.
Thank you. I think this your presentation was really stimulating. I think in offering a methodological intervention in terms of how we're thinking about the big questions facing labor. So I really appreciate that. I want to think about the relationship between 2 different points you raised. One is about Bourgeois and factory regimes and the limits of that approach. I mean, I think certainly, you know, whatever criticism aside about his extended case method, I think one of the really positive developments that came out of that body of research is, you know, the argument that the politics of production are not just shaped by what happens within the factory, right? The state, factory and gender regimes, these are all really important spheres that labor scholars must consider in order to understand what kind of politics will actually play out. And, you know, I'm very excited about one of the slides that you put up about how we actually disentangle how we understand labor agency, resistance, recalcitrance, and resilience. And I think one of the questions I have for you are, how are you thinking about the interrelationship between these 3? Because it seems to me, if we're really to understand, for example, the connection between resilience and resistance, we absolutely have to have a broad conception of politics and the significance, or at least the influence of gender and family regimes, ethnic and racial regimes, migration regimes, citizenship regimes, in shaping these different modes of labor agency.
Okay, so and now here in the very first row.
Yes, thank you, Paul, for your talk. Actually, I have to correct the impression that I'm overly optimistic, of course, and it's very easy in one of the points you've raised, basically. You said that I was very optimistic with regard to the fact that workplace plays some role in current debates about labor and so on, and that it maybe attract increasing attention during the next years. And that is actually not the case. One of my central critiques is that the workplace doesn't play a role in our discussions, especially not in our discussions on international level about informalization, precarization, which is basically focusing on employment relationships and not on the workplace. But I would actually argue that this is fatal, because what we need to do is to understand what happens at the workplace, to see certain kinds of struggle coming up, and to understand dynamics of change. And this leads me to my second point. I would fully agree that there is no natural connection between the conditions of labor and labor agency. I still think, however, that if we want to talk about potentials for change, the labor process is the natural phenomenon we need to look at, because central conflicts in society obviously are based on the relation between capital and labor, and I'm quite sure we agree on that. But where can you study that? You have to study it where it happens, so to say, at the workplace, and try to find out how, for instance, new technological phenomena like digitization play out, if they strengthen workers, if they don't, under which conditions they have which effect. And I don't think we have to subscribe to the assumption that workers are necessarily emancipatory subjects or the revolutionary subject or what have you, to see that certain dynamics can be studied at the workplace in the first place, and that we need to direct our attention to that sphere of society, economy, whatever you want to call it, if we want to understand how struggles evolve or do not evolve, basically. And probably what you talked about, new kinds of controlling the labor process and so on, take us quite a way to understand why open rebellion doesn't occur, basically. And I completely agree that this is not the only thing we should talk about, open rebellion and strikes. But I think what we face now is really a bit of a complicated situation, because on the one hand, I would argue we have to look at the workplace, we have to go into companies and see what happens there. And on the other hand, Martin has reminded us that we should stay clear of oversimplified narratives. But how can we actually get at a kind of discussion which considers changes at the workplace, case study basis, very deep and detailed analysis on the one hand, and discussions about overarching trends? For instance, between different economic sectors in one country, for instance, between a workplace in one country and workplace in other countries under different political conditions, for instance. So I think these are the discussions we need. So what do we have to know about the workplace, and how can we put it into relation to broader developments? Because I'm really persuaded that a lot of social dynamic comes out of capital accumulation and the workplace. I wouldn't know where else to look, actually.
Okay, 3 complex questions. I think you should try to stay short, because we have a lot of other people interested in reacting.
So 3 complex questions with short answers, which is really a signal to ignore 3/4 of the content of the questions, I think. Thank you for the questions. The first one from our autonomist comrade. I didn't disagree with most things you say. Maybe I need to reconsider my hostility to autonomism. It was, after all, where I started, so maybe... But your last point, in a sense, reinforces one of the things I was trying to say, which, your point about some of the more recalcitrant dissent-based actions in Turkey are being undertaken by workers who vote AKP. In a way, was my point, that we shouldn't necessarily expect there to be links between the labour interest in the workplace and the labour interest in the broader society. Admittedly, there will be circumstances where those links will be a lot easier to make than in the example that you've given. But in a way, that's the point, that it is too easy for labour scholars and people on the left to, in a sense, to discount labour agency if it's politically suspect, for these kind of reasons. Now, there may be, in fact, occasionally good reasons for doing that, but anyway, I didn't necessarily disagree with what you said. The second speaker, again, I agreed with most of the points that you made. Borrow's book was important for developing the notion of a politics of production that linked the external to the internal, although ironically, of course, Borrow made his name through the concept of manufacturing consent, in which he claimed, completely wrongly, that consent was generated entirely within the relations of production, which really makes little sense. But like I said, politics of production is a really important concept. There are things to learn. The extended case method is something that I teach my students. I think there's things to learn from it. I just think there was too much extension. The point about, I did unfortunately have to rush through that point about the different types of labour agency, I was trying to be a smart ass by referring to the 3 R's. You know, in Britain, that's a big thing. The 3 R's are reading, writing, and arithmetic. Right. So, you know, I did resistance, recalcitrance, and resilience. There are links between them. One point I would make is those links have become harder, despite the fact that I've spent a lot of time trying to defend the idea of labour agency at the kind of grassroots, if you like. If you compare to, you know, the 1970s reference point, we said there was a stronger and organic link, certainly in the UK anyway, between the informal day-to-day resilience and recalcitrance on the shop floor and the kind of union and extra-union resistance strategies. And in a lot of places, those links are either diminished or dead. That doesn't mean the labour agency is dead, but the links between them are much harder. It is much harder in a call centre or an Amazon fulfillment centre to organise and to make links between that everyday recalcitrance, which, trust me, does go on, and the kind of broader strategies. And that brings me to Nicole's point about, because that was also about links. Something like insecurity can be a focal point for broader, if you want to call them class-based campaigns. They can be this in 2 ways. One is political parties can make insecurity a central feature of their policies and campaigns. It was actually one of the few things I had a beef with about the Labour Party manifesto in Britain, which I thought was generally excellent, that they made nothing of labour market insecurity, because these things link different workers together in terms of their conceptions. But on a more grounded control regime way, one of the things I was going to say about people working for online labour platforms, but for kind of digital-based companies in the gig economy in general, is certainly in the UK there's been some really successful campaigns around Uber and Deliveroo and other gig economy companies, precisely around issues of insecurity, in which different groups of workers were linked to social movement type campaigns focusing around insecurity. But the key point here is that what labour process research points to is the centrality of the control relationship. And if you look at the court cases which these workers brought through predominantly through their unions, some small radical unions in some cases, it was precisely to establish the control relationship, that these people were not freelancers, that you know, so that in a sense that classic notion that they were insecure because they had a fake employment relationship, right? And they had a lot of resonance, right? And I think this is how we kind of multiply and make connections to those campaigns.
Okay. We have just time for one other round of questions, comments. There was one hand raised in the very last row, just where you're standing. Yeah, over there.
I'm Lily from the British Library. I think this is really a question, and when we're thinking about the politics of production, I think and if we want to think about it more carefully, I wonder whether we need to break down the term that you use as the mass worker. And I say this because it has less purchase for me. When you're saying it, I'm thinking of the mass white worker. And I say this as someone who comes from a brown working class background and has all members of her family who are in working class jobs, that the attachments that you talk about are not mediated by just sort of the conditions in the workplace, but also mediated by experience of racism, Islamophobia, and other such things, and that the positive attachments that you've mentioned are not there, and that divergence about what is expected from the workplace and what they get for at least sort of members of the brown working class are not necessarily there as well. And when you say that the sort of the highest vote or highest share of working class votes went to the Conservatives, I'm wondering how true this is for the brown working class and the UK, who, as far as I know, is disproportionately represented or underemployed or employed in working class positions. And I would say that sort of also, I mean, these people vote overwhelmingly for Labour and continue to do so, and I'm not wondering whether that share has gone to the Conservatives, as you've mentioned.
Okay, there were other hands raised. So, okay, just in order to not to make you run out too much, there's one person just behind you. No, just turn back. Oh, thank you.
I have only one small question because I wondered why exit is on your list of the three R's, and I wondered if this is a result of thinking about labor movements as labor movements and not of movements as movements of labor. I mean, maybe you could develop this a little bit because I think it's a central question. How do we see the migration on the one hand and the flight of labor from capital as a part of a possible organization of labor agency?
Okay. Then I saw two hands over there. There's one person wanting to react.
I just wanted to know how you see cases where employers give out parts of the production process, sometimes quite large parts, to home workers, which is very common in India, but I believe quite common here as well. I mean, in the West.
Okay, did I overlook someone? Because it's now the very last chance for one person to ask or comment. Okay, so you're the last one, and then, Paul, you can take half an hour to react.
Hi, my name is Eddie Cottle from the Neil Agate Labour Studies Unit, South Africa. I just want to comment on probably what I think is important issue you raised, which is the question of, or the centrality of the question of insecurity, which I think is a key component of, I think, any kind of campaign strategy. The reason why I raise this is that in our recent strike wave, which started around 2011 to 2014, there were direct challenges by workers to the labour process. So, for example, you find that in the post office, workers won the demand to basically become incorporated as full-time employees of the post office, for example, so they're no longer outsourced. So that outsourcing struggle went to the university level as well and became generalized. So you had the whole insourcing campaign developing there. You had the massive protest by farm workers, which engulfed about 25 rural towns in 2012. And what you see now is some kind of shift from the seasonal to more permanent forms of employment, although it's still on a small scale. So in a sense, and also, of course, the Marikana mining massacre was also around essentially not only about the wages, but also how work was being carried out through the high rates of subcontracting within that industry. So what I'm saying is that there seems to be positive signs of the working class actually challenging the very process that has unfolded from the 1970s. Of course, my question is, are we seeing similar trends developing elsewhere in the world where you have these direct challenges to this kinds of insecurity that's taking place. I think, secondly, the consequence of this strike wave is actually huge, and it kind of rings to the grave digger thesis, actually. Because why I say this was that the entire country has basically shifted in terms of the political terrain. You've had political splits. You have the galvanizing of the multitude, as if you want to use the term, of the student movement and other sectors coming in after the strike wave. So it seems as if the working class played a pretty leading role in the broader mobilization that's currently taking place within South Africa. Thanks.
Okay, Paul.
Okay. Going through them in sequence, and look, I'm not going to pretend that I'm competent to say much about some of these questions and observations. I think the first questioner might be investing a little too much in the notion of the mass worker. I mean, the mass worker was a construct used in the 1970s as, like I've quoted, by its advocates as a privileged subject of exploitation. It was a way of trying to explain what looked like was happening on the ground in terms of, in the big American, European, and other mass production plants. None of that was necessarily disconnected from an understanding that the ethnicity of those workers was irrelevant to those struggles. The small leftist group that I belonged to in the 70s also was very active in the big Ford plants in Dagenham and in other places, where a very large minority of the workforce was black, and in which the ethnicity of those workers was highly relevant to the agency and the campaigns and so on. So, I mean, the mass worker as a concept, in a sense, is dead and buried, so we shouldn't be too worried about, you know, trying to expand it or whatever we do with it. But it was certainly capable of understanding varieties of social composition of that labour. And, of course, you're right that the voting patterns, if you dig into them, would show that I actually, to be honest, haven't seen what the breakdown of ethnicity, but I'm sure you're right that the vast majority of ethnic minority voters would have backed Labour, and you know, one needs to understand these sources of differentiation. Interestingly, if you want to throw something into, there's a surprisingly large number of ethnic minority voters backed Brexit. I just throw that in as a matter of interest. Exit, yes, I would have talked about exit more if I hadn't screwed up the timing and had to leap over 2 out of my 3 little mini case studies of control regimes. Chris Smith, one of my colleagues, has done a lot of work on what he calls the double indeterminacy of labour power. That labour power is always embodied in the worker, and one of the sources of power that workers have as a commodity is mobility and exit, and certainly exit. I mean, if you take one of my arguments there, I differentiate resistance from recalcitrance, for example, on the grounds of partly of intentionality. People have to know they're resisting. It has to be upwardly directed. Exit can be resistance if it meets those criteria. A lot of the time, exit is recalcitrance. It's people just having enough and being unable to stand. I mean, if you read some of these accounts of working in an Amazon fulfillment center, I mean, never has anything been as badly misnamed as a fulfillment center. I actually started to call them fulfillment centers. Think about it. There's a fantastic piece in the Financial Times, without any political spin that any of us might put on it, which would frighten the living daylights out of you, about working in those centers. And there's a lot of people who have simply exited from that because they just can't stand it. That's a weapon of recalcitrance. It's not really a weapon of resistance because, let's face it, they're just replaced by the next person until they're replaced. Interestingly, some people, I mean, we found this, I'm sure most of you are aware of this, studies, particularly done by labour process researchers in call centres, show the same things. And this is sometimes called a sacrificial HR strategy. That's its official name. I once did a report based on the research, because I had to, otherwise they wouldn't have let us in, to the call centre executive of a big bank in the UK, a global bank. We gave our report, which was predictably gloomy about what they were doing to their workforce, and pointed out the high levels of exit. And the head of the executive took us for lunch afterwards and said, yeah, that was very interesting, thanks. We've been having that debate before you got there, but it's much less expensive to replace people who leave than to make the work better. That's so seriously. That's what he said, or not use slightly different words to make work better, but that was the line. But exit is really important. But take one other example. I was going to give an example from visual effects or games workers. Highly skilled, young, often male workers have used their capacity for mobility in the film industry and in the games industry to improve their wages and conditions. But once the industry began to contract, that mobility was no longer possible. So when you look at labour agency, and this is a point that Nicole made, and I absolutely agree, you have to start with capital and its strategies and what it does to see how the possibilities and sometimes, in a sense, the necessities. If Labour wants to be active as an agency in games or VFX now, it can't just be use mobility, because you have to have places to be mobile too. And there are signs of the emergence of more collective, recalcitrance and dissent in those areas. Yeah, I'm going to be honest and say that I really don't know much about either home workers and the research on that. And you've certainly got me on the struggles in South Africa. The one point I will finish on is to say the kind of examples you give are consistent with one of the points I was trying to make, which is that if we distinguish between accumulation regimes, regulatory or employment regimes and control regimes, we can see that the target of labour agency, in other words, where we make our demands, may not always be the employer, because the rules may be being set on insecurity and security in the regulatory regime. And, you know, the capacity to define someone as a worker, it might be easier to pursue those struggles through the state than through the employer.
Thank you very much to Paul, to all of you for the participation in the debate. I think everybody has enough to digest, and we should hurry up before the food gets cold.